Thank you very much. We're going to cover up the guys for today, and I'm going to talk about the history of the census, which has been my primary research interest for many, many years. And I'm going to talk specifically about one case study, namely what happened in the 1920s, which is that the U.S. did not reapportion the seats in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College after that census. Most people are not quite aware of that, but it is relevant to where we are today. So I'm going to probably come down so I can see you all better, and we will go from here. So the census has been around since, I'm going to go backwards here, and these are shots of the continuity that we have of the people responding at the household door, a census taker coming and collecting information about each family in the United States. The census is a rare and repeated and what I would call an unobtrusive event in American political life, right? This is the 2010 was the 23rd. We're going to be on the 24th in 2 years. You can see I'm a numbers person, 45 presidents, 58 presidential elections, 115 Congresses. So this is a rare event in American politics. It's repeated. We've done it successfully every decade since 1790, despite wars, including the Civil War, economic crises, and lots of political turmoil. It's unobtrusive. Most people don't remember the last one, the one before that, or the one before that. I often start these talks by saying, do you remember where you were on April 1st, 2010? And I get blank faces. If I say, where were you on September 11th, 2001, you all remember. So that's an interesting problem. So we have to redo the history every decade. So where does it come from? Well, right here. We, the people of the United States, formed a state in 1787. And this is the authorization language in the statute, in the Constitution. Our representatives in direct taxes shall be apportioned according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service, indentured servitude, that was, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. That's the infamous 3/5 compromise. The actual enumeration shall be made by Congress and repeated every 10 years in such manner as they, meaning Congress, shall by law direct. And this has been the base understanding ever since. Now, important sort of side note, the voting is in a different piece of the Constitution. So the electors for the House are set at the state level, not at the national level. And this has implications in our discussions today about who the people really are as opposed to who the voters really are. Okay. Now, why is the census important? Well, the U.S. is the first country in the history of the world to take the census and tie it so tightly to its political system, right, in this kind of automatic process. It is also, the U.S. has also had a dynamic and diverse population history, and it's the combination of these two things, the fact that the population grows very rapidly, it moves around, and so forth, that makes the census a particularly sort of important event in the history of the country. We have to take power away from areas that are not growing as fast as others and move them every 10 years, which is what we do, what we've done except for the 1920s. So dynamism is measured by growth, diversity is geographic, and so we have, and then of course is what we usually talk about is racial and ethnic diversity. I may skip over some of I have some slides that I'm just going to have you look at and not talk about very much, but this is just some numbers, right? Look at that, you know, right? 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 The U.S. versus other countries, right? And it's still going, just look, right? the growth of the states, the growth of the size of the house. So growth is the element here that needs to be understood. And then of course, the Census Bureau today tells us all about this and pioneered in some of this visualization material for it. So these are population change maps. I took Pennsylvania, my own state of Wisconsin, and Texas to show you that you can drill down, and you can go down to the local level on these things. And differential population. Now, this is an interesting problem, and it's counterintuitive. There's a New York State population, right, since 1790, except for that little blip, 20 years ago, it goes up. Look at its congressional delegations, the size of its congressional. So counterintuitively, New York grew, but its members of Congress, the size of its delegation in Congress declined. Why? Because someplace else was growing faster at that point. That makes no sense to most ordinary people as the census comes around each day and has to be explained. This is the 2010 seats. You can again see from that map that the winners are in the South and the West, the losers are in the Northeast and the Midwest. We can draw a similar estimate for 2020. Geographic diversity, again, the country marching westward. When the framers wrote the Constitution, it was just that little sliver down the East Coast. And of course, gerrymandering, which I'm going to leave to my colleague Ken Pruitt to talk about. It's an old tradition, 1812, right? All right, now, racial and ethnic diversity, right? White, African American, Asian, and Latino Hispanic, right, if you will. Okay, now, 1920. What happened in the 1920s? So the 1920 census is the only one in the history of the country that didn't lead Congress to reapportion as it had before. And up until 1920, every decade, Congress wrote a new statute reallocating the seats in the House and the Electoral College. They couldn't get a bill through the entire decade of the 20s, even though the presidency and both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans. In other words, so it wasn't divided government. So the issue was, at the time, and I'll talk about this, there was both a demographic and a political crisis. The demographic crisis, as people saw it at the time, was, oh my Lord, we've become an urban nation. And that was interpreted as a dangerous development, right? Too many people in cities. The second issue was the politics, which is a little later, which is that a lot of business was still being done on the floor of the House, and it was getting big. It had gone from 65 members to 435 members, and so the decision was, let's not make it any bigger. And so you get a cartoon from this. So the census itself was not plagued by controversy, but it was seen to be a routine result. But the crisis emerged early in the 20s, and so it's a little different from the arguments that we're having now, including the fact that there is a trial right now going on in the city of New York, in federal court, about the methodology of the 2020 census. This emerged after the census, not before it. Why? Why did it happen, and how did it get resolved? How am I doing on time? Am I good? Okay. Okay. So the census was the year that historians used to say this is when the U.S. tipped from being a rural nation. And of course, this is 300 years at this point, 1607 to 1920. It's a long time. So so the idea that the U.S. was about to go to be a metropolitan suburban society was shocking at the time. World War I was not popular. It had rocked the country. There were race riots. There was vigilante violence. The largest strike wave in the history of the country hit in 1919, 1920. 20% of the entire labor force went on strike sometime during that period. And European immigration, which had fueled the urban expansion for the previous 30 years, resumed in full force after the war was over. And it seemed like the crisis was getting worse. Now, these are some graphs of the violence. you can see the spikes around 1920 and 1870, 1870, obviously, and I could tell you a separate story about the Civil War era, but we'll do in the 20s today. So you can see that there are things going on. And here's one example, just one, actually taken out of John Hyam's old book, Strangers in the Land. This is the kind of stuff that was all over the media and the press in the 1919, 1920. This is rioters, the Italian race war in Frankfort, Illinois. People murdered, people getting out of town. This is going on all over the country, if you will. And so the sense is that something has to change. The political crisis was that if the census numbers were allowed to take their course, right, the seats would move to all of these new areas where that was the source of the disturbance and the crisis of American society. The losers balked at giving power to the winners. And they began to argue about the nature of the Constitution Clause. And Congress had faced this before, and there are various mechanisms that allow them to sort of get out of the political controversy that failed in the 20s. What can they do? Well, you change the size of the House of Representatives. You make it bigger, and so even though a state is not growing as fast as another state, it doesn't lose a seat. You just give an extra seat and make the body bigger to someplace else. You change the apportionment formulas. There is a wonderful book called Fair Representation that takes you through the mathematics of apportioning legislatures internationally. You could admit new states to the Union, right? And of course, the other issue that has plagued the country was how you dealt with getting rid of the 3/5 compromise, ironically, which increased the power of the former slave states, right? Okay. So Section 2 of the 14th Amendment was designed to handle that, right? Which it didn't, but as we'll see. Why did these mechanisms fail? There were no territories. Arizona and New Mexico had been admitted in 1912. The House chamber, as you saw, was becoming crowded. There were two versions. There was a fight within the Census Bureau over the proper apportionment formulas, the mathematics of it, that confused the living daylights out of Congress, and as you might guess, and so what they began to also argue about was enforcing the Section 2 of the 14th Amendment and excluding aliens from apportionment, right? In other words, changing the constitutional base. Okay, so how did they get out of it? Because of course we did resume reapportionment after 1930. So first of all, like good politicians, they study the issue. And they studied the issue for 8-9 years. The second strategy was immigration restriction. Right? So in 1924, the U.S. shut off its historic open immigration system with the National Origins Act, which also used the census to justify which places and people would come into quotas. And so Congress decided that the racial and ethnic balance of the country should remain as it was in 1790. And so the census of 1790 was used to write the formulas for the apportionment law, for the immigration law. And the third was suppression of the violence, which you deport foreign-born agitators, and you develop an ideology, a very powerful ideology, that says that the United States will remain a white Protestant country, right, if you will. And that's the culture of the 1920s. So by 1929, interestingly, Herbert Hoover, who had been the Secretary of Commerce during the 20s, who was in the Commerce Department, oversees the Census Bureau, became president in 1929, and he was actually a force to actually move this forward. And they changed the statute to create what was called an automatic apportionment. So the Commerce Secretary said, look, after the 1930 census, I will report the census numbers and allocate them among the states And we'll just use the last reapportionment formula we did, which would have been the 1910 one, and it'll go into effect unless Congress acts. All right? But, this is the but. This created a new sort of set of issues that, in fact, are still before us now. Congress removed the language from the statute that required compact, contiguous, and equally sized districts from the language. So essentially what they did is they kicked the problem to the state level and allowed the states to malapportion within the state or not, or elect representatives at large. So if a state got new members of Congress, they didn't have to allocate them geographically. They could simply elect them at large, which has a conservative political bias. Rural constituencies continued to dominate well into the 1960s until what we call the reapportionment revolution and the Voting Rights Act were passed. The good example of this, New York State in the 1930s, the smallest district had 90,000 people, the largest had 799,000 people, and that was perfect. And the Supreme Court thought that was just fine. What didn't happen? The House size was not increased and still is at 435. There's good political science theory that says that should be changed, and you'll see in a minute. They didn't enforce Section 2B of the 14th Amendment, and that awaited the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to begin to address. And the constitutional amendment to exclude aliens from apportionment did not advance. So there's the introduction, New York Times article, from what it would have looked like. The apportionment clause would have been rewritten to say representatives shall be apportioned among the states by counting the whole numbers of persons in each state, excluding Indians, not taxed, and aliens, which would have, right. And so we are now having that same conversation today again, and the Trump administration is, of course, trying to put a question on citizenship on the 2020 census, which would begin to lead to this discussion reopening. What you see here is on the right is the way the House size grew from 1790 and sort of stopped in 1910, and we had 435. Congress could at any point increase that House size if they wanted to, right? But they have not. Now, this is the Section 2B of the 14th Amendment, which was supposed to reduce the number of seats a state got if they denied voting rights to anyone in any category of people in their state. Right? The basis of representation shall be reduced. That was never enforced. And so we are now starting to have some of these discussions for 2020, and including some of the questions about the citizenship clause. And I think I'm going to stop here and let my colleague, Ken Pruitt, pick up with where we're going to go in the future. Thank you.